Hello and welcome. I hope that you are doing well. Thank you so much for joining me here today. We're going to talk about books, and we really are talking about a lot of books today because we are going to talk about my top books of 2024, and there's about 21 books included. So let's get right to it. And I hope that you don't mind to keep me on track. I am using notes today. So, as you know, if you have joined me before, I have done the top books of every year's reading since 2020, and it seems to grow. Like that first year it was only 5 books, but we didn't do many videos that year, and so it's grown to about 21 books in the last few years. And since we're talking about that many books, I have gotten a chair so I can sit down. I've got a nice warm drink so I can keep my throat refreshed while I'm talking. So what I do is I choose categories, and then I find the best book of the year for that category. I do have notes, so I might refer to them occasionally because it's a lot of books to talk about and try to remember everything. So, we're going to get started. The first category is mysteries, and there are several categories of mysteries, so we'll just get started with the mysteries and then we'll move on to the next category. So, best mystery. And this is a book that I came into late because it was published in 2019, but I first read it this year, and I'd wanted to read it for a while, and I finally got to it. It is a psychological thriller about a therapist trying to find out why a woman murdered her husband. It's The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. If you have not read this book, I really recommend that you read it. It kept me guessing the whole time I was reading it. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it just because I don't want to be too spoilery. The next book is, let's put those there when we're done. So the next book is the book for the category YA Mystery, and this is The Reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. Any of you who have read the A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series know that Holly Jackson writes a really good mystery. This one is a little different because, as you can tell from the title, someone who had disappeared reappears. And it is Rachel Price, and it's very difficult for her daughter Belle, because Belle has a lot of questions. Rachel actually disappeared twice the day that she disappeared, and the first time Belle was with her, and Belle was like 2 years old then. And then the second time, Belle was found in the family car abandoned along the side of the road. Rachel was gone, no one knew what happened to her. She did not leave a note or anything, and Belle was just sitting in the car happily babbling away to herself. Now that Rachel has returned, Belle has a lot of questions. Even more than she did before, because obviously her mom has come back, so why did she leave in the first place? And the other family members are acting kind of weird. And so we're left to wonder if Belle is ever going to get the answers that she really needs, and what really happened on that day. The next one is a YA mystery in a school setting. And with this one, I went with The Bitter End by Alexa Dunn. And this follows a group of privileged high school students, and they're on their senior excursion, which should be an amazing experience because the senior excursions usually end up going to really exotic places or exciting places. But people on this trip didn't get these senior excursions that they signed up for. They are reassigned to a digital detox weekend. And they don't know why. They think that it's related to a party that happened 3 years before. So the story is told from multiple perspectives, and it is told in the current time period on this trip with a detox weekend where they have no phones and actually a snowstorm hits. So they're kind of in dire circumstances, but there are also flashbacks back to that party, and they're left to wonder if they are even going to make it out alive. The next category is classic mysteries. So the best classic mystery that I read this year, and you know if you've been watching these videos that I've been reading a lot of Agatha Christie lately. I, in the past, read a lot of the Miss Jane Marple books, and so I've been reading more of the Hercule Poirot books, and the best one that I read this year was The Mysterious Affair at Styles. It has a very clever plot, and it's going to keep you guessing. Next, we have our final mystery categories coming up: Best YA Series and Best Series. Let's start with the best YA mystery series, and it is The Agatha's Duology by Kathleen Glasgow and Liz Lawson. It includes The Agathas and The Night in Question. Two characters, Alice and Iris, have very different backgrounds. Alice disappeared 5 days over the summer after her boyfriend dumped her. When those 5 days were over and she was rediscovered, a lot of people were angry at her. The police were angry because they felt like she wasted their time and the taxpayers' money. Her parents were angry because she disappeared and they didn't know where she was. When another girl goes missing, the police at first think it's another stunt, that this girl just decided that she was going to do the same thing that Alice did and she was going to disappear. Then they think that Alice's ex is the one responsible. Alex is determined to investigate and prove both of these assumptions false. But she can't do this alone, and she enlists the help of her tutor, Iris. Alice has been reading a lot of Agatha Christie books, and so she uses the techniques that she's learned from those books and detectives like Miss Jane Marple to solve the mystery. So it's a duology. These are both of the books in the series. Very well written, very well told, really good series. Our final mystery is the best mystery series, and it is the Ben Packard series by Joshua Moling. He's a Minnesota writer, and it begins with the first book, And There He Kept Her. It's set in a northern Minnesota city, a made-up northern Minnesota city. So Ben experiences tragedy where he's living in the cities, and so he decides that he is going to move to the small town where his family vacationed when he was a child. This is also the place from where his older brother disappeared. So Ben figures he's got two things he can do here. He's hired as a sheriff's deputy, and so he can investigate the new cases while also looking into what happened to his brother. The second book is And There He Kept Her. We don't find out much about his brother's situation in these two books, but the third book is coming out in February, and we should learn a whole lot more about his brother. So that's an exciting one for next year. And those are our mysteries. So let's move on to some fantasy books. Since we just talked about series, let's move on to the next category of series, which is Best Series Fantasy. And that series is the Empyrean series, which include Fourth Wing and Iron Flame. The third book in this series, Onyx Storm, will be published and released on January 21st. So another book to keep your eyes open for next year. Our next fantasy is the best fantasy with a parallel universe, and we have Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I read a couple Neil Gaiman books this year. This one is really good. So under London, there is a parallel world that most people have never even dreamed of. When Richard Mayhew helps a girl, he is catapulted out of his safe, comfortable life into this world under London. My copy also includes the short story, How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, so you get Neverwhere and the short story all in one book. Best vampire book I read, and I've read a few vampire books this year. The best one that I read is Crave, which is the first book of the Crave series by Tracy Wolff. I really enjoyed reading vampire books this year, and I'm not sure how that started, but there we are. Grace's parents have died, and she goes to live in Alaska with her uncle, who is the administrator of a private high school. Her cousin is thrilled to see her, but as she is there, even though her uncle is nice, and even though her cousin is nice, she realizes that something weird is going on at this school, and Grace cannot figure out what it is. If you've read the Twilight series, you might not like this series. I've heard people who've read the Twilight series that didn't like this one. It's actually a fun series. I really do recommend it. So the best YA fantasy is House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. Iris Hollow and her sisters have always been strange, from the identical stars on their throat to their hair to the way that everyone is drawn to, especially her two older sisters. Something happened to Iris and her sisters 10 years ago. And her sisters are Gray and Viv. All three of them disappeared on New Year's Eve and returned to that exact same spot on that exact same street a little later. No one knows what really happened. The girls don't remember what happened. But because of their disappearance, others have developed wild theories about where they were. Even their dad had problems with them after their return. He got to a point where he even asked Iris what happened to his real daughters. Gray and their mom argue one day, and Gray has not returned to the family house since. Viv moved out soon afterwards, and they're off in the world doing their thing. Iris is still living at home with her mom and going to school, but whenever Gray and Viv come back to town, they all get back together. And they are planning to get back together this time because they're both back in town, but Gray never shows up. And they go in search for her, following every clue they can turn up. And it becomes apparent that this disappearance is somehow related to what happened to them as children. Best YA fantasy romance. I have a series here. It's the Letters of Enchantment duology, Divine Rivals, and Ruthless Vows. And this is a very cool book, from the bare cover, which is really cool, to the story. Two rival journalists are communicating with one another through the use of a pair of very special typewriters. They don't realize who they're writing to, but as the correspondence continues, they grow to care for one another. And when Iris becomes a war correspondent, Roman must decide if he's going to follow his own idea of his future or what his family wants. Best historical fiction, which is a fantasy this time. It is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. This book is set in 16th century Spain, which is also the time of the Spanish Inquisition, where the church frowns upon the use of magic so much that it can lead to the use of the person practicing magic. Lucia is a scullery maid, and she uses her magic to get through her days. When the family she works for discovers her secret, they start using her to make their dinner parties more exciting and more popular. But there's a spy at one of the dinners, and he will stop at nothing to gain the favor of the king. And so Lucia and the family she works for are thrown into this world of holy men and magicians. But her Jewish faith puts her at risk. So she must carefully tread the line between magic and mysticism, all the while working to keep her secrets safe. Next, we're on to the best book with paranormal elements, and it is one that I hadn't read for a long time, but I'm glad I did now. It's Carrie by Stephen King. And it took me way too long to read this book. And for so long, I was just kind of scared of Stephen King books. And when I started reading them, I would try to find whatever were described as the least scary of his books. But I never really wanted to read this book. Then I read Tiffany D. Jackson's book, The Weight of Blood, which is an homage to Stephen King, and I became really interested in this book. I'm not going to go into many details. Carrie has an overly scrupulous and religious mother who mistreats her. She's considered an oddball, Carrie is, by her classmates and really quite bullied. But when she discovers her telekinetic powers, she's going to use them to get revenge. And the best new book with older book vibes. So last year I read some Ray Bradbury, especially Something Wicked This Way Comes. I really enjoyed it. And so I was thrilled to give this book a chance, and it kind of gave me the vibes of Something Wicked This Way Comes. So this book is dedicated to some older horror and fantasy writers, and Ray Bradbury himself is even mentioned in it. Charlie has had a difficult life. His mother died when he was young, and in grief, his father turned to drinking to deal with it. So Charlie has kind of had to grow up quickly and take care of himself and his father. When Charlie's 17, he meets a neighbor, Howard. And Howard has a lovable dog, but he also has a huge secret. And then Howard dies, and he leaves Charlie a lot of gold and an unbelievable story contained on cassette tapes. And in that story, Charlie learns that he has been left with a huge responsibility. If you like Ray Bradbury or similar authors, you really do need to read Fairy Tale by Stephen King. All right, we've got a few books left. Let's keep going. So I always like to do what I call a breath of fresh air book. And it's just a refreshing book that's very different than the other books that I've read or other books I've ever read, really. And this time I've also included a breath of fresh air book. And it does really feel different than anything I've ever read before. This book is so good. And it is Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. And I have to say, I have loved every book I've read by this author. I'm not going to summarize this book because I don't want to give too much away, but I'm just going to give you a description of this book that is contained in the front flap of the book. Looking at real estate isn't usually a life or death situation, but an apartment open house becomes just that. When a failed bank robber bursts in and takes a group of strangers hostage. Each of the hostages carries a lifetime of grievances, hurts, secrets, and passions that are ready to boil over. None of them is entirely who they appear to be, and all of them, the bank robber included, desperately crave some sort of rescue. If you like different books, you really do have to read that one. Our next book is also a little different, and it is the best fiction book set in a school. And it's the Murder Your Employer book by Rupert Holmes. And yes, this is the same Rupert Holmes who wrote the song Escape. You might know that song is the Pina Colada song. Back to the book. Cliff is determined to get rid of his boss, who has bullied other employees so much that two of them have committed suicide. But Cliff's plan fails and he is taken away. But he learns that he is given a second chance. He's taken to the McMaster's Conservatory for the Applied Arts. It's a secret school in a secret location. Here he meets other students that have similar goals. One in particular who enjoys it way too much. This book is so unique and has a dry sense of humor, and it's meant to be more humorous than serious, and it is so good. New favorite author is a category where I talk about a book that I read that caused me to read all the books I can get my hands on by that author. And that book was Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood, which just led me to read more Ali Hazelwood books. So Check and Mate is a YA book, but it's really intended for the older YA category because of some of the mature themes that are talked about in it. The character is also 18-year-old. She deals with mature topics. I'd say this is really for the 15-year and older age group. I don't have the book here because it's checked out. In fact, most of the copies in the system are checked out, and most of the author's other books are checked out. A couple other ones are The Love Hypothesis and Love Theoretically. Both of those are regular fiction. All right, best YA contemporary book, and that is 24 Seconds From Now by Jason Reynolds. This is a romance book written for YA boys, and it's a sensitive portrayal of love, written for boys, written by a man. It's an excellent book. I've got a couple biographies coming up, and I generally don't include biographies, but this year I read several excellent biographies. So we're going to talk about one, which is an author who lived from 1890 to 1976, and I'll consider this the best biography of a historical person. The other biography is a more contemporary person. So first we have the best biography of a historical person, and that is Agatha Christie, An Elusive Woman by Lucy Worsley. I've talked about it recently, so I won't talk about it too much, but I really enjoyed reading about Agatha Christie's life and how the things that she experienced influenced her writing. We're down to our last two books here. So, the other biography, the biography of a more contemporary personality, is Friends, Lovers, and the Big Horrible Thing by Matthew Perry. I have the print book here. It's also available as an audiobook. You have a couple options for that. You can request the compact disc version, or you can just listen to the audiobook on Hoopla if you're in our library system, or if your library offers Hoopla. And the cool thing about the audiobook is that he reads the book. So it's almost like you're in a conversation with Matthew Perry. A drawback of the audiobook is that you don't get the really awesome foreword by Lisa Kudrow. This book gave me insight into Matthew Perry's life and makes the struggles that he underwent more understandable, for me at least. All right. And lastly, I have the best short story that I read, and this is The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clark. I read this book just after the winter solstice, just before Christmas, and it was such a good seasonal winter read. I'm planning to read it again next month because winter continues, and it's always nice to have a folktale, cozy winter reading experience to look forward to. There we are. I hope that you enjoyed this look